gavel hadn't even finished falling when the first bench scraped across the floor. It wasn't the sound of order. It was the sound of something about to break. A uniformed officer was on his feet before anyone in that courtroom had time to process what was happening. His chair spun backward. His voice loud, aggressive, the kind of voice that had spent years learning how to fill a room and silence it at the same time, cut straight through the low murmur of proceedings like a blade through paper. People flinched. A woman in the gallery grabbed her husband's arm. A court reporter's fingers froze above her keys, and in the center of all of it, standing perfectly still, was a woman who hadn't moved a single inch. She wasn't tall in a way that demanded attention. She wasn't dressed to intimidate. There were no signals, no warnings, nothing about her appearance that said what was about to happen was even remotely possible. She simply stood there, hands loose at her sides, watching the officer close the distance between them like she was observing whether he grabbed her arm. What happened next took less than 2 seconds. There was a shift barely visible, almost polite in how quietly it began, and then the officer was airborne. Not thrown dramatically, not launched across the room in some Hollywood spectacle. He was redirected. His own momentum, his own weight, his own reckless forward aggression. All of it turned against him with a precision that looked almost gentle until the moment his back met the floor with a sound that rattled the wooden benches and stopped every single person in that courtroom cold. He was pinned before the echo died, one arm locked, one knee placed with surgical accuracy. His service weapon, the one he'd carried into that room like a badge of superiority, removed from its holster and placed quietly on the floor beside him, out of reach, in a single fluid motion that most people in the room didn't even fully catch. He wasn't unconscious, but he wasn't moving either. The silence that followed was the loudest thing that courtroom had heard all day. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. A child in the back row whispered something to his mother, and she hushed him so fast it barely qualified as a sound. 3 attorneys exchanged glances, but none of them stood. The judge, a man who had presided over some of the most volatile cases this district had ever seen, sat behind his bench with an expression that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite satisfaction, but lived somewhere in the complicated space between both. The woman stood up slowly, adjusted the collar of her jacket, looked down at the officer once, not with contempt, not with triumph, just looked, the way you look at something that is no longer a threat and therefore no longer worth significant attention. Then she turned back toward the front of the room and waited. That was the moment. That was what you just saw. Now let's go back to where it started. Because what just happened didn't begin with a grabbed arm. It began hours earlier, in the quiet before a storm that almost no one in that courtroom saw coming. She arrived at the courthouse at 7:43 in the morning. Most of the building was still settling into the day, security guards finishing coffee, clerks sorting files, early attorneys claiming their preferred seats and spreading papers across tables like flags marking territory. The halls had that particular kind of energy that exists before anything important has happened yet, that low hum of anticipation dressed as routine. She walked through the main entrance without drawing attention. That wasn't an accident. Nothing about her was accidental. Her name was Lieutenant Commander Denise Carver, but the courtroom wouldn't know that for a while. For now, she was just a woman in a dark blazer and simple slacks, carrying a single manila folder, moving through a busy government building the way water moves around stone, quietly, efficiently, without resistance. She found her seat in the gallery and sat down. 2 people noticed her immediately. The first was the judge. The Honorable Raymond Crosby had been on the bench for 19 years. He'd seen every kind of person walk into his courtroom. The guilty who believed they weren't, the innocent who'd already given up, the powerful who expected different rules to apply to them, and the rare few who walked in carrying a quiet that was heavier than most people's noise. He recognized Denise Carver the moment she crossed the threshold. His face gave almost nothing away. That was a skill you developed after 2 decades on the bench, but if you were watching closely, and the right people were watching closely, you would have caught it. A pause, barely half a second, a stillness behind his eyes that hadn't been there the moment before. He looked down at his papers. The second person who noticed her was a defense attorney named Marcus Webb. He was seated at the table to the left, reviewing notes with the focused urgency of a man who hadn't slept particularly well. When Denise walked in, he glanced up the way people do when movement catches peripheral vision, and then he stopped. His pen stopped. His hand stopped. He stared for just a moment longer than was comfortable, then turned deliberately back to his notes, but his jaw had tightened. And it stayed tight. Neither man said anything. Neither man acknowledged what they both clearly felt. The gallery filled slowly. Journalists took their positions. Spectators settled. The case being heard today had drawn a crowd, not a massive one, but the kind that forms when word gets around that something uncomfortable is about to be examined in public. The kind of crowd that shows up not quite knowing what they're hopping to see, but knowing they don't want to miss it. The case involved a law enforcement operation from 3 years prior. A joint task force operation that had gone badly wrong in ways that the official report described as an operational deviation. What that sterile phrase actually meant was that 4 people had ended up dead who weren't supposed to be, and that someone somewhere had made decisions under circumstances that were still, officially, classified. Denise Carver had been present during that operation. Her exact role, what she'd been doing there, who had authorized her involvement, what she had or hadn't witnessed, was precisely what this hearing was designed to uncover. Or, depending on who you asked, designed to bury. The officer walked in at 8:02. His name was Sergeant Dale Steiner. He had the walk of a man who believed every room he entered was better for his presence. Wide shoulders, chest forward, the particular brand of confidence that comes not from accomplishment but from years of never being seriously challenged. He was assigned to testify today as a witness for the prosecution, one of several officers who'd been present during the operation in question. He scanned the gallery when he entered. It was the kind of scan that wasn't really about awareness, it was about audience. He wanted to see who was watching, and when his eyes landed on Denise, they stopped. He looked at her the way certain people look at things that don't fit their expectations. Not quite recognition, more like offense. Like her presence in that room was a mild inconvenience he hadn't been warned about. His lip curled slightly. Then he moved on, found his seat, and leaned back in it like a man who'd already decided how today was going to go. He had no idea. The proceedings opened with the standard formalities, statements from counsel, reminders about the classified nature of certain testimony, instructions to the gallery. Judge Crosby managed it all with the practiced efficiency of someone who has run thousands of hours of courtroom procedure and has long since stopped finding it interesting. But today, beneath the routine, something else was running. A current, invisible to most but unmistakable if you knew how to read a room. The first witnesses were called and questioned without incident. Technical testimony, chain of command details, timeline reconstruction. The prosecution built slowly, methodically, the way experienced attorneys build, not with dramatic accusations but with layers. Fact placed upon fact until the structure became undeniable. Sergeant Steiner sat through it all with barely concealed impatience. He shifted in his seat. He checked his watch. He leaned over once to whisper something to the officer seated beside him, and they both looked toward Denise when he did. She didn't react. She sat with her folder in her lap and her eyes on the front of the room, and if she was aware of being watched, and she absolutely was, she gave nothing back. It was the prosecution's lead attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Solis, who first brought Denise's name into the formal record. I'd like to draw the court's attention to the presence of an individual who has been called to provide testimony in this matter, Solis said, her voice clear and deliberate. Lieutenant Commander Denise Carver, currently attached to Naval Special Warfare Command. Room shifted, not dramatically, not the way rooms shift in movies, but if you were watching, really watching, you could feel it. A slight adjustment in posture across the gallery, a few whispered exchanges. The court reporter's fingers moved a little faster for a moment, then steadied. Steiner sat forward. Lieutenant Commander Carver, Solis continued, was present during the operation in question in an advisory capacity, the precise details of which remain under a federal classification order. However, Her account of events during the critical window of that operation has been requested by this court and will be entered into the record today. Steiner turned his head and looked directly at Denise. She didn't look back. Advisory capacity, he muttered, just loud enough, just intentional enough. The officer beside him smothered something that was almost a laugh. Judge Crosby's eyes moved to Steiner. One beat, two beats, then back to Patricia Solis. You may proceed, counselor. The morning wore on, testimony continued to build. Solis was methodical and precise, extracting detail by detail from each witness with the patience of someone who understood that cases like this weren't won with spectacle. They were won by not giving the other side anything to grab onto. Every answer she drew out was clean. Every line of questioning moved the timeline forward, piece by piece, toward a moment that still hadn't been fully described in open court, the classified operation. What happened during the critical window? Who gave what order? And why 4 people who should have walked away didn't? Marcus Webb, the defense attorney, pushed back at every opportunity. He was good, genuinely good, the kind of attorney who understood that his job wasn't to find the truth, but to make the truth complicated enough that simple conclusions became impossible. He challenged timelines. He questioned the reliability of recollections. He introduced procedural objections with the casual confidence of someone who had spent years learning exactly where the edges of those rules were. But his eyes kept moving to Denise, not constantly, not obviously, but consistently enough that if you were paying attention, you'd notice. Every few minutes, without fail, his gaze would track left toward where she was seated, register something, concern, calculation, something harder to name, and then return to the front of the room. He knew something. He'd known it since she walked in, and whatever it was making him uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with the testimony currently being entered into the record. Steiner's behavior, meanwhile, was getting harder to ignore. He'd started with muttered comments. Small ones. Just quiet enough to technically be dismissible as nothing, but loud enough to serve their actual purpose, which was to signal to everyone in his immediate vicinity exactly how much respect he felt this proceeding, and the people in it, deserved from him. He questioned the relevance of testimony he didn't like. He made small sounds of disbelief at answers that contradicted his version of events. He treated the courtroom the way some people treat spaces they believe they own. Judge Crosby issued the first warning at 10:14, Sergeant Steiner. His voice was calm, final, the voice of someone who has given thousands of warnings and knows exactly the weight each one carries. You will conduct yourself appropriately in this courtroom or you will be removed from it. Am I understood? Steiner met his eyes, held them just a half-second longer than was respectful, then nodded once. Yes, Your Honor. He leaned back, crossed his arms, and for about 20 minutes he behaved. But 20 minutes was the limit of what his self-control could manage today. Because at 10:37, Patricia Solis called Denise Carver to the stand. She stood, moved to the front of the room, settled into the witness chair with the same quiet economy of motion she displayed all morning, no performance, no hesitation, no visible awareness of the dozens of eyes tracking her every step. She was sworn in. Her name entered into the record, her rank and affiliation noted. And then Solis began. The questions started carefully, as they always do in cases involving classified material, boundaries established, parameters clarified, the court reminded of what could and could not be discussed in open session. Denise answered everything directly. No elaboration beyond what was asked. No emotional coloring. No pauses designed to create effect. She spoke the way someone speaks when they have spent a very long time in environments where precision of language is not a stylistic choice, but a survival requirement. She was, from the first word, completely unreadable. And that specific quality, that absolute composure, was what undid Sergeant Steiner. He'd walked into that courtroom expecting a particular kind of person. Someone who could be rattled. Someone whose composure was a performance rather than a foundation. Someone who, under enough pressure, would crack in ways that served his purposes. He dealt with 100 witnesses who looked calm until they weren't. He knew exactly how to find the seam in someone's confidence and apply pressure to it. He could not find a seam in Denise Carver, and the longer Solis questioned her, drawing out careful, measured answers that piece by piece were assembling a picture that Steiner did not want assembled, the more his composure deteriorated in direct inverse proportion to hers. He leaned forward, his arms uncrossed, his jaw tightened in ways that were becoming visible from across the room. He exhaled sharply through his nose at answers he didn't like. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at his hands. He looked everywhere except at Denise's face, because looking at her face meant confronting the fact that she was not afraid of him, had never been afraid of him, and was constitutionally incapable of performing the kind of deference he'd been expecting since she walked in. Webb noticed. Webb had been noticing for the last 40 minutes. He'd shifted his chair slightly, repositioned his notepad, done all the small, unconscious things people do when they are bracing for something they can see coming but cannot stop. Solis finished her direct examination at 11:09. She looked at Judge Crosby. "Nothing further at this time, Your Honor," Crosby nodded, turned to Steiner's side of the room. "Cross-examination," and Steiner stood up. He didn't walk to the podium, he walked toward her. There's a difference, a significant one, between an attorney approaching a witness stand with questions prepared and an officer approaching with something to prove. Steiner moved through that courtroom like the space between him and Denise was territory he was claiming with each step. He stopped closer than the standard professional distance, just close enough to be a statement. "Lieutenant Commander," he said. The title came out wrong, not quite mocking, not quite respectful, living in the uncomfortable space between the two. "You said you were present during the operation in an advisory capacity." "That's correct," Denise said. "Advisory." He said the word again slowly, turning it over like it tasted strange. "So you were observing, in part, in part." He looked out at the gallery briefly, a small performance, checking his audience. "What does that mean exactly, in part?" "It means my role had multiple components," she said. "Observation was one of them. The other components are classified." He smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. Convenient. "Sergeant Steiner," Crosby's voice. Even, precise. Steiner glanced at the bench. "My apologies, Your Honor." He looked back at Denise. "Let me ask you something else. You said that during the critical window between 2200 and 2245, you were positioned at the secondary entry point. That's correct. You're asking this court to believe that from that position, you had a clear line of sight to the primary staging area." "I'm not asking the court to believe anything," Denise said. "I'm telling the court what I observed." Something moved across Steiner's face. Quick. Contained, but it was there. "Right," he said. "What you observed." He clasped his hands behind his back, began to pace slow, deliberate, the way people pace when they want you to feel like the space belongs to them. "Tell me something. How long have you been with Naval Special Warfare?" Solis was on her feet. "Objection. Relevance." "Allow it," Crosby said. Briefly, Steiner spread his hands. "Just trying to establish some context, Your Honor," Denise answered. She gave the number of years without inflection. "Impressive," Steiner said, in a tone that made the word mean its opposite. "And in all that time, all those years, have you ever been involved in an operation that went wrong?" "Objection," Solis said again. "Vague and prejudicial." "Sustained," Crosby said. "Rephrase, Sergeant." Steiner turned back to Denise, and something had shifted in him. Some final layer of professional restraint had thinned to the point where what was underneath was starting to show through. "Let me be direct," he said. "You're sitting in that chair. You're giving this court testimony about an operation that cost 4 people their lives. And your entire account depends on this court accepting that your memory, your judgment, and your version of events is reliable." He paused. "Why should anyone in this room believe you?" The gallery stirred. A murmur ran through the benches, not quite protest, but close. Denise looked at him. Her expression hadn't changed. Her hands were still. Her voice, when she spoke, was exactly the same as it had been for the last 40 minutes. "Because I'm telling the truth," she said. It was the simplicity of it that hit hardest. No defensiveness. No emotion. Just 4 words delivered with the absolute certainty of someone who has operated in environments where a lie can get people killed and has therefore long since stopped bothering with them. Steiner stared at her. And then, very quietly, very deliberately, he said something that crossed a line so clearly that 3 people in the gallery audibly inhaled. "People like you always think they're telling the truth." Room went still. Judge Crosby's pen stopped moving. Marcus Webb closed his eyes briefly. Patricia Solis was on her feet before the echo of Steiner's words had fully settled. Objection. Your Honor, that comment is "I heard it, Counselor," Crosby said. His voice had changed. Not louder, colder. Sergeant Steiner. Approach, but Steiner wasn't moving toward the bench. He was still looking at Denise, and whatever he saw in her face, or more precisely, whatever he didn't see, whatever absence of fear or submission or discomfort he couldn't find there, cracked something open in him that should have stayed closed. "You know what your problem is," he said, loudly now, the professional veneer gone. "You come in here with your rank and your classified files, and you think that makes you something. You think this room is supposed to just accept whatever you say because of what you're wearing." Sergeant Steiner. Crosby's voice was sharp now. "She's lying," Steiner said, turning to the judge with the conviction of someone who has decided that volume is an argument. "Whatever she told this court, whatever she's protecting under that classification, it's Sergeant Steiner." Courtroom had gone rigid. Every person in the gallery had stopped breathing in any way that counted. The court reporter had stopped typing. Two security officers near the door had straightened and were watching with the focused attention of people trying to calculate whether they were about to be needed. Steiner turned back to Denise, and he stepped forward. "Dealt with people like you my whole career," he said, his voice dropping now into something quieter and therefore more threatening than the shouting. "Think the rules are different for you. Think you can walk into any room and—" He reached out and grabbed her arm. It wasn't a light grab. It wasn't accidental contact. It was deliberate, fingers closing around her forearm with the specific intention of establishing physical dominance, of making her feel what he believed she needed to feel. Time did something strange in that moment. It didn't slow down the way people describe in dramatic stories. It compressed. Everything happened in a space that shouldn't have been long enough to contain it. For just a fraction of a second, the narration shifts not into chaos but into something quieter. A flash. Not memory exactly. More like reflex given context. A mountainside in conditions that don't get discussed in public. A hallway with no lights. A door that needed to open before the people on the other side of it knew anyone was coming. The specific, total, bone-deep understanding of what a threat feels like in the body and what to do with it before the thinking mind has time to get involved. No anger, no hesitation. Instinct. Her hand moved first. A rotation precise, breaking his grip at the weakest point of his finger's contact. His momentum, still carrying forward, became a problem for him rather than a tool. Her body turned, dropped slightly, redirected. His weight, all of it, the confidence and the badge and the decades of believing no one would ever say no to him with their hands, went where she sent it, down hard. His back hit the floor and the sound traveled to every corner of that courtroom and ricocheted off every wall and ceiling and piece of furniture and landed in the chest of every single person present like a physical impact. She was on him before the sound finished traveling, knee placed, arm controlled, weapon removed from holster and set aside. Not hidden, not taken, just moved to where it could no longer be a variable. He was contained, she was still. And the courtroom, that room full of attorneys and journalists and spectators and security officers, and one judge who had known exactly who she was from the moment she walked in, said absolutely nothing. That's where we are. That's the moment we've been building toward since this story began. But here's what you don't know yet. Here's what that silence is hiding, what that room is holding, what the judge's expression and the defense attorney's closed eyes and the security team's hesitation are all pointing toward. Because Sergeant Steiner didn't just assault a civilian. And the story of what happens next, the consequences, the reveal, the truth about who Denise Carver actually is and what her presence in that courtroom was really about, is only just beginning. Stay with us. If this story already has you gripped, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming and drop a comment below. What do you think happens next? The first sound that broke the silence was the judge's gavel, not struck in anger, not brought down with the theatrical force of someone trying to reassert authority over a room that had slipped beyond control. It came down once, measured and deliberate, the way a surgeon makes an incision, precisely enough, no more, no less. The sound didn't echo. It landed, and the room absorbed it, and somehow that was more authoritative than any amount of volume could have been. "This courtroom will come to order," Judge Crosby said. He wasn't looking at Denise. He wasn't looking at the officer on the floor. He was looking at the room, at the gallery frozen in collective suspension, at the attorneys gripping their tables, at the security officers standing in the doorway calculating their next move with the specific paralysis of people who have never encountered a situation their training covered. "Everyone will remain seated," Crosby continued. "No one will approach the floor." That last instruction was directed at the security team. They stopped, stayed where they were. Their eyes moved between the judge and Denise and the floor where Steiner lay, and they did what the judge told them to do, because the judge was the architecture of this room, and when architecture speaks, you listen. Steiner was breathing hard. Short, sharp breaths, the kind that happen when adrenaline meets humiliation, and the body doesn't know which one to process first. He turned his head slightly, and his cheek pressed against the courtroom floor, and he looked out at the gallery from that angle, from below, from the ground, from the position his own aggression had put him in, and every person he'd scanned for audience when he first walked in was now staring back at him. He stopped struggling. Denise stood up slowly. She didn't dust herself off. There was nothing to dust off. She hadn't hit the floor, hadn't lost her footing, hadn't broken anything in herself in the process of breaking his momentum. She simply rose, straightened her jacket with two small adjustments at the lapels, and turned back toward the witness stand. She didn't look at Steiner again. That specific absence of a look, that refusal to grant him the significance of a second glance, was somehow the most devastating thing she could have done to him. And every person in that room felt it, even if they couldn't have articulated exactly why. Marcus Webb finally exhaled. It came out of him in a long, slow, almost inaudible stream, the breath of a man who had been holding something in since 8 o'clock this morning and was only now allowing himself to release it. He placed both palms flat on the table in front of him, looked at his hands for a moment, then looked up at Judge Crosby. "Your Honor," he said. His voice was steady but carrying something underneath it, weight, something effortful. "I'd like to address the court." Crosby looked at him. "In a moment, Counselor." He turned first to the security team. "Sergeant Steiner will be escorted out of this courtroom. He will be held for formal processing regarding his conduct today. That is not a request, and it is not subject to discussion." Officers moved forward. Steiner didn't resist. The fight had gone out of him somewhere between the floor and the silence, between the moment his body hit the ground and the moment he registered that not one person in that room was rushing to his defense. They got him to his feet. He was steady physically, at least, but there was something gone from his posture, some structural confidence that had been load-bearing and was now just absent. He looked smaller, not in size, in weight. They walked him toward the side door. He passed within a few feet of Denise on the way out. She was already seated again, folder in her lap, eyes forward. She did not turn her head. The door closed and the courtroom breathed. "Your Honor." Webb was on his feet the moment the room resettled. His voice was different now, not the careful, technically precise instrument it had been all morning, navigating objections and threading procedural needles. This was something more direct, more personal. "Need to make a disclosure to this court," he said. "One that I should have made when these proceedings began this morning. I chose not to for reasons I believed were professionally sound. I now believe I was wrong." Watched him. "Go ahead, Counselor." Webb turned slightly, not quite toward Denise, but in her direction. An acknowledgement, then back to the bench. "Have prior knowledge of the witness," he said. "Specifically, I have reviewed a portion of her service record in connection with a separate matter. That record is largely classified, as this court is aware. But what I can tell you, what I should have told this court this morning, is that Lieutenant Commander Denise Carver is not here in an observer capacity. She is not a peripheral figure in the events being examined today, and she is not someone whose testimony can be fairly assessed without understanding who and what she is." Patricia Solis had put down her pen. She was watching Webb with the focused stillness of an attorney recalibrating in real time. "What exactly are you disclosing, Mr. Webb?" Crosby asked. Webb straightened. "Lieutenant Commander Carver is an active member of Naval Special Warfare Command. More specifically, she holds a designation within a unit whose operations are classified at a level that prevents me from nomming it in open court. He paused. What I can say is that the designation she holds is not administrative. It is operational, and it is among the most demanding certifications available to any member of the United States military. He let that sit. The gallery was absolutely silent. She is, in the most direct terms available to me, Webb continued, a Navy SEAL, decorated, operational, and present at the event in question not as an observer, but in a capacity that this court has not yet been fully briefed on, because the full briefing requires a clearance level that most people in this room do not hold. Someone in the gallery exhaled audibly. Then the murmurs started, not loud, not unruly, but real. The sound of understanding moving through a room, of pieces clicking into place that had been sitting in plain sight all morning without anyone fully recognizing their shape. A Navy SEAL in a blazer and simple slacks, carrying a manila folder, sitting quietly in the gallery since 7:43 in the morning. The officer who had grabbed her arm, who had walked into this room like he owned it, who had spent the better part of 3 hours performing his contempt for everything and everyone he deemed beneath him, had put his hands on someone who had trained in conditions that most people couldn't survive, who had operated in places that didn't appear on any map available to the public, who had in all likelihood neutralized threats far more dangerous than a courtroom sergeant with something to prove, and done it in environments where the stakes of failure were measured in lives, and she had taken him down in under 2 seconds, without breaking her composure, without raising her voice, without, as far as anyone in that room could tell, even significantly elevating her heart rate. Patricia Solis was the first attorney to fully recover. "Your Honor," she said, "the prosecution has been aware of Lieutenant Commander Carver's designation and has structured its examination accordingly. We were operating under guidance from Naval Special Warfare Command regarding what could be disclosed in open court." Crosby nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment, that particular judicial quiet that isn't emptiness but deliberation, the kind of silence that has weight and direction. "Mr. Webb," he said finally, "your disclosure is noted and entered into the record. We'll address any questions of procedural fairness in chambers." He paused. "Is there anything else you need to say to this court at this time?" Webb looked at Denise. This time directly, unambiguously, she met his gaze. Her expression held something that might have been acknowledgement, a small, measured thing, barely visible, the kind of communication that happens between people who have both been sitting with the same information and are only now allowed to confirm they were sharing it. "No, Your Honor," Webb said. "Nothing further." He sat down. Judge Crosby called a 15-minute recess. The gallery erupted the moment the gavel fell, not into chaos, but into the kind of urgent, overlapping conversation that happens when people who have been forcibly silent are suddenly given permission to speak. Journalists typed furiously into phones. Spectators leaned across each other. Two attorneys from another case entirely, who had wandered in during the morning to wait for a different courtroom to open, were now texting with the focused energy of people who understood they had accidentally witnessed something significant. Denise walked out of the witness stand, crossed the front of the room, and took her original seat in the gallery. People moved aside for her. Not dramatically, not with the performative deference of people trying to signal that they had always respected her, because most of them hadn't, not before 20 minutes ago, not before a man's body hitting the floor had restructured their understanding of who was in the room. They moved the way people move when they have genuinely recalibrated. When the information has landed and the response is real, she sat down, opened her folder, reviewed something inside it. A woman 2 seats away leaned slightly toward her. She was maybe 60, gray-haired, the kind of face that belonged to someone who had attended many courtroom proceedings and thought she had seen most of what they had to offer. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. Denise looked up. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." "That man," the woman started, "has been removed," Denise said, simply. Finally. In a way that closed the subject without hostility, the woman nodded, and then after a moment said something she clearly hadn't planned to say out loud. Never seen anything like that in my life. Denise looked at her. And for the first time all morning, for the first time since she'd walked through the doors of this building at 7:43, through every hour of testimony and tension and provocation, and the moment on the floor, something shifted in her face. Not a smile exactly. Something smaller and more honest than a smile. "Neither has he," she said. The recess ended. The room resettled. When Judge Crosby returned to the bench, something had changed in his bearing as well. The professional distance that judges cultivate, that careful, practiced neutrality that is not coldness but is deliberately not warmth, had thinned slightly. Not disappeared. Thinned. As if the 15 minutes had given him permission to let a fraction of something real show through. "Before we continue," he said, "I want to address what occurred in this courtroom today, not for the benefit of the record, though it will be in the record, but because what happened here deserves to be named clearly." He looked out at the room. A witness was physically assaulted in this courtroom by an officer of the law who was present in a professional capacity. That assault was preceded by a sustained pattern of conduct, verbal, behavioral, and in my judgment racially motivated, that this court was too slow to shut down. He paused. "I was too slow to shut it down. That is a failure of this court's responsibility to the people who appear before it, and I will be addressing that formally." The room was very still. "Lieutenant Commander Carver," Crosby said, and now he looked directly at her, "this court owes you an apology. What occurred here today should not have been allowed to reach the point it reached. The fact that you handled it the way you did, with restraint, with professionalism, and with a level of composure that frankly exceeded what most people in this room, including myself, would have managed, reflects a character that this proceeding failed to honor appropriately." Denise met his eyes. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said. It was 4 words, delivered with the same precision as everything else she'd said today. But the gallery, that room full of people who had spent the morning watching her receive contempt in silence, heard those 4 words differently now. Heard them the way you hear something when you finally understand the full weight of the person speaking. Crosby held her gaze for one more moment. And in that moment, just there, just briefly, the professional mask came down far enough to reveal something underneath. Recognition. Respect. And something that sat at the edge of the complicated history that existed between them. A history this courtroom didn't have full access to yet. A history that had made his expression pause when she walked in this morning and hadn't fully let him go since. He looked back at the room. "We will continue," he said. The afternoon session was different from the morning in ways that went beyond what had happened on the floor. The energy had restructured itself. The case, the operational deviation, the 4 deaths, the classified window of 2200 to 2245, was still the same case. The facts hadn't changed. The testimony still needed to be entered. The questions still needed to be asked and answered within the careful boundaries that classified material imposed. But the room listened differently now. When Denise returned to the witness stand for continued questioning, the gallery leaned forward in ways it hadn't all morning. Not because she was performing differently, she wasn't. She gave the same measured, precise, emotionally unadorned answers she'd been giving since 11 o'clock. But the people receiving those answers were different. Their filters had changed. The contempt that Steiner had tried to install in the room, that low-grade atmospheric bias that certain people are skilled at generating, that makes everyone around them subtly less willing to take seriously what they should take seriously, was gone. Removed with him when the door closed. What remained was testimony, real testimony, from a real witness, about real events. Solis moved carefully through the critical window. Denise walked the court through her position, her sightlines, what she had observed and what she could confirm with certainty, and what remained beyond the threshold of what she was authorized to discuss in open session. Her account of the moments leading up to the 4 deaths was precise, time-stamped almost to the minute, delivered without drama, and exactly consistent with the physical evidence that had been entered into the record that morning. Webb cross-examined her again, this time without the shadow of Steiner's energy distorting the space. He was thorough. He was doing his job as he should have been, as he was good at doing, but the questions were clean, professional. He challenged specific details, pressed on timelines, asked her to clarify the difference between what she'd observed directly and what she'd inferred. She answered every question the same way she'd answered every question all day. Directly, without performance, without the slight defensive adjustments that most witnesses make under pressure, that small calibration between what's true and what sounds better. She just told the truth. And the truth, entering the record clearly for the first time today, was significant. The 4 deaths had not been the result of an operational mistake. They had not been, as the official report's phrase had suggested, a deviation from protocol caused by confusion in the field. They had been the result of a specific decision made by a specific person at a specific time, a decision that Denise Carver had witnessed, had documented, and had attempted to flag through appropriate channels in the 48 hours that followed, and that had been suppressed. She said this calmly. She said it the way she said everything, without heat, without the trembling urgency of a whistleblower who needs the room to feel the weight of what they're revealing. She said it the way someone says something they have known for 3 years and have been waiting for the appropriate legal and procedural moment to say in a place where it would matter. This was that place. This was that moment. And the room, judges, attorneys, journalists, spectators, the woman with gray hair 2 seats over who had asked if she was all right, heard it land the way it deserved to land. Webb objected twice. Both objections were overruled. He didn't push further. He knew when testimony had entered the room in a way that couldn't be walked back, and this was that. His job now was to manage the damage, not prevent it. He was good enough at his job to know the difference. Solis finished her redirect at 3:41. Nothing further, Your Honor. Looked at Denise. Lieutenant Commander Carver, you are excused. She stood for the last time from the witness stand, walked back through the courtroom the way she had walked through it all day, quiet, controlled, taking up exactly the space she needed and not a fraction more. She collected her folder from her seat in the gallery, nodded once briefly to the gray-haired woman who had asked if she was all right. The woman nodded back. Then she walked toward the door. And this time, this was different from any other moment in the day, different from her entrance this morning or her movement to the witness stand or her return from it. This time, every eye in the room followed her, not the way eyes follow someone they're watching for weakness, not the way Steiner's eyes had tracked her all morning, looking for a seam, looking for a way in, looking for whatever confirmation of his assumptions he needed her to provide. These eyes followed her the way eyes follow something they have just genuinely understood, the way you watch something you will remember, the way a room looks at a person when the story of who that person is has finally caught up to the room's ability to see it clearly. She reached the door, pushed it open, walked through. And for a moment, just a moment, the courtroom was completely still, holding the shape of her absence the way a room holds the shape of sound after the sound has stopped. Then the gavel came down. Proceedings resumed. The work of the afternoon continued, as it had to, as it should, as the law requires regardless of the weight of what has just passed through its chambers. But something had shifted, permanently, in the way that shifts don't unshift. Outside, the hallway was quiet. Afternoon light came through the high windows in long, flat angles, the kind of light that belongs to the part of the day when the morning's urgency has resolved, and what remains is just the fact of things. Denise walked the length of the hallway without hurrying. Her footsteps were even. Her breathing was even. Her face, visible now to no one, held exactly the same expression it had held inside, which is to say, almost no expression at all, and beneath that something very deep and very settled. A younger officer, courthouse staff, not someone she recognized, was walking the other direction and made brief eye contact. Then looked again. Then said, clearly without fully intending to say it out loud, "Is that—" He stopped himself. She kept walking. At the end of the hallway near the exterior doors she stopped for a moment. Not to collect herself, there was nothing to collect, no scattered pieces to reassemble because nothing in her had scattered. She stopped because stopping, sometimes, is simply what you do at the end of something. She thought briefly about Steiner, not with anger. Not even with the specific satisfaction that would have been understandable and human and entirely forgivable. She thought about him the way you think about a situation that has resolved itself, not pleasantly, not as it should have, but resolved. He had made a decision. The decision had consequences. The consequences had arrived with the speed and precision that decisions of that kind tend to produce when the person on the receiving end has spent the better part of 2 decades training for exactly this. She had not wanted it to happen. That mattered to her, not for anyone else's benefit, not for the record, but for her own. She had sat in that room for hours. She had absorbed the comments, the glances, the loaded questions, the thinly veiled language that everyone in the room had heard clearly even though no one had named it clearly enough. She had absorbed it because that was the professional thing to do, because the setting required it, because there was testimony to give and a case to support, and a room full of people who needed this proceeding to function correctly. She had absorbed it right up until the moment a hand closed around her arm, and then she had responded. Not with anger, with training, with the same absolute crystalline efficiency that she brought to everything, every mission, every room, every situation that required her to be exactly as much as was necessary and nothing beyond it. It was over in under 2 seconds, and she felt, standing in that hallway in the afternoon light, exactly the same as she had felt before it happened. That was perhaps the most important thing. Not the response itself. The response had been inevitable from the moment his hand moved, the moment that particular chain of cause and effect had been set irreversibly in motion. What mattered was the afterward, the stillness, the fact that it had not cost her anything internally, that she had not already given 1,000 times in 1,000 harder places under 1,000 higher stakes. She was fine. She had always been fine. The people who looked at her and saw someone who could be rattled, diminished, made small by assumption and contempt, and the casual cruelty of someone who believed his authority was structural rather than earned. Those people had always been reading the wrong story. She pushed the exterior door open. The afternoon hit her warm, real, the city continuing in its absolute indifference to what had just happened in a courtroom 3 floors above the street. Traffic, a vendor, someone laughing into a phone. The enormous, indifferent machinery of ordinary life, running exactly as it always ran, requiring nothing of her, offering nothing dramatic. She walked into it. Sergeant Dale Steiner was formally charged the following morning. The charges included assault, conduct unbecoming, and violation of courtroom conduct standards. There were additional internal affairs questions opened regarding the pattern of behavior documented throughout the morning session, the comments, the loaded questioning, the escalating hostility that multiple attendees had noted and that the court reporter had faithfully transcribed in its entirety. None of it in the transcript looked better than it had sounded in the room. Most of it looked worse. His career, which had carried him for over 20 years through a system that had rarely said a clear and final no to him, arrived at its no. The case itself, the operational deviation, the 4 deaths, the classified window, the decision that had been made and suppressed, moved forward on the strength of Denise's testimony. It was as these things tend to be, slow. The law moves slowly when it is working correctly, and the people with the most to lose from it moving at all have resources to slow it further. There were motions. There were appeals to classification. There were procedural challenges that bought time in months rather than minutes. But the testimony was in the record, clearly, permanently, said by a witness whose credibility had been tested in a courtroom, in public, in real time, by a man who had thrown everything he had at it and had found precisely nothing to grip. It was in the record, and records don't unwrite themselves. Judge Crosby's formal statement, issued 2 days later, addressed the court's failure to more promptly curtail Steiner's conduct and included specific changes to courtroom protocol that would take effect immediately. It was thorough, specific, and written in the language of someone who had spent 2 days being honest with himself about a failure, and had decided that honesty required something concrete in response. In a footnote, an unusual choice for a formal judicial statement, unusual enough that the journalists who covered it noted the footnote specifically. Crosby wrote that the court had been privileged to receive testimony from a witness of exceptional character, and that the manner in which that witness had conducted herself throughout the proceedings represented, in his judgment, a standard the court itself had failed to meet in its duty of care toward her. That footnote made 3 publications. Denise did not read any of them, or if she did, she gave no indication of having done so, which in her case amounted to the same thing. There's something worth sitting with at the end of this. Not a lesson exactly. Lessons have a way of arriving prepackaged, with edges already smoothed down, made safe for easy swallowing. This is something harder than a lesson. It's an observation offered plainly, and what you do with it belongs to you. A man walked into a room today convinced he understood what he was looking at. He was certain, the kind of certain that doesn't question itself, that has never had to develop the habit of questioning itself, because the rooms he'd spent his life in had always confirmed his certainty before he had to test it. He looked at a quiet woman in a dark blazer, and he saw something dismissible. He saw someone whose composure he mistook for fragility, whose silence he mistook for compliance, whose restraint he mistook for limitation. He was wrong about every single thing, and his wrongness, complete, absolute, assembled from a lifetime of unchecked assumptions, cost him his footing in under 2 seconds. Literally. The floor came up and met him, not because someone attacked him, but because he had put all of his weight behind a certainty that had nothing beneath it. That's the thing about assumption. It feels exactly like solid ground, right up until it isn't. The woman who walked out of that building in the afternoon light had never needed him to see her correctly. She had never needed the room to understand her. She had walked in with the information she carried, the training, the record, the decorated, classified, operational history of someone who had done things in places that most people will never go, for reasons that most people will never fully know. And she had carried it quietly, the way people carry things that are real and do not require performance. She didn't need to be believed to be true. She just needed the moment to arrive. And when it did, when the hand closed around her arm and the chain of cause and effect completed itself with the speed and precision that 2 seconds allows, the room finally saw what had been standing in it all along. Power isn't always loud. Strength isn't always visible. And the most dangerous mistake you can make is to assume that because someone is quiet, they are not prepared. Because someone is still, they are not capable. Because someone has not yet shown you what they are, that what they are is anything less than everything you were not ready for. She walked out of that building. She did not look back. Some people don't need to. If this story found you, stayed with you, or changed even slightly how you look at the quiet people in the room, drop a comment. Tell us what moment hit hardest. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Stories like this one are waiting for you, and we drop them every week. Hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming next.